Somebody said, well, Reverend, who is my new daddy? And somebody said that while your mother and your father may have had you, some of them did not want you. All right. And one thing about an adoption, nobody adopts a child that they don't want. And so we have been adopted. Romans 8:16 and 17 says, the Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God, and joint heirs with Christ. If indeed we suffer with him, that we may also be glorified together with him. In other words, we have been adopted into a royal family. It doesn't matter if you came from across the tracks. It doesn't matter if you came from down under. You've been adopted into a royal family. See, when you were born a commoner, you expected to stay a commoner. But when you adopted from a commoner into the royal family, then you become royalty. When you were a commoner, they treat you like a commoner. But when you become royalty, they treat you like royalty. When you were a commoner, you acted like a commoner. But when you got adopted into royalty, then you begin to act like royalty. What is your lineage? What are you writing about your life? What's going down in the spiritual pages? What's going down metaphorically about what you've done in your life? Brings me to our second point. We said we'll talk about our lineage, then we'll talk about our life. Verse number 2 says, the Spirit of the Lord spoke to me. The choir already sang, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. And so David felt at liberty. David was a musician. He says that his word was on my tongue. In other words, what David said was, I wasn't speaking what I wanted to speak. How many of us give folks a piece of our mind? If you like me, you ain't got a whole lot of mind to give. And we're giving folks a piece of our mind. And normally when we say I would give them a piece of my mind, or I gave them a piece of my mind, we weren't telling them about Jesus. Go ahead. Go ahead. So David said, I wasn't speaking what was in my heart. I wasn't speaking what I wanted to speak. I wasn't speaking what the devil gave me to speak. I wasn't speaking maybe even what was justified to be speaking, but I spake what the Lord my God gave me, and that's what was on my tongue. The God of Israel, notice he had said before of Jacob, Jacob's name was changed from Jacob to Israel. So David is giving an indication that I've been changed like Jacob was changed. And he says, the God of Israel said, the rock of Israel spoke to me. In other words, he was the rock of Israel. He says, God is my rock and my salvation. He says, God spoke to me. How many have heard God speak to them? You ever been in a conversation with somebody, your spouse, your child, or somebody, and you were trying to get something in, but they just kept going and going and going and going and going and going. And when you got time to say something, they were already prepared for what they was going to say next. And so although you spoke, they didn't hear you. Somebody said, well, Reverend, what are you saying? You know, that's how we get with God. Sometimes we're so busy telling him what we want, what we don't want to do, and what we're not ready for, that we can't hear his still calm voice talk back to us. How many have heard God speak? He who rules over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God, and he shall be like the light of the morning when the sun rises. So here David is talking about justice. What David is saying is that he who rules justly, he will be like the sunshine on a nice bright day. He will be like the sun that comes out on a day after there's rain. He will give flowers and nourishment and cause them to come out and be pretty and green. But in other words, what he's saying is that he who is just is refreshing. And at a time like this where politicians are crooked, a time like this where pastors are compromising, it's good to have a just leader. It's good to have a just person. It's good to have a just boss or supervisor on your job. Your David talks about being just. He says, the morning without clouds, like the tender grass springing out of the earth, like clear shining after rain. Although my house is not so with God, yet he has made with me an everlasting covenant. Notice what David says here. David doesn't pretend that he was a good father. David says, it's not so with my house. In other words, where David is saying that, yeah, I messed up, but the problem is, yet though I messed up, and I like the yet because a lot of us need to have a yet in our life. He said, yet I was not all that I could be, yet I did not do all that God told me to do. God made a covenant with me. I mean, he made a covenant with God. He said, order in all things and secure. For this is all my salvation and all my desire. Will he not make it increase here very quickly? As we look at life, we understand that our life, as it is today, that we were born under sin. And the fact that we were born under sin and we don't have the same covenant that David had with God. And so because we're born under sin, if justice was to have its way, and we were to receive what we deserved, hell is where we would lift our eyes in our next life. In other words, let me put it this way. If you're driving down the highway and you're doing a speed that's in excess of what's posted on the side. Anybody follow me? All right. And a police officer pulls up behind you with the sirens and the lights going and pulls you over. And I've never understood why they asked you this. Sister Ross, you know you were speeding, they know you were speeding, and they asked you, did you know how fast you were going? Some others will tell you, yeah, I know exactly how fast I was going. And some will say, no, how fast was I going? And then they'll go ahead and tell you how fast that you were going. But justice says that police officer is going to write you a ticket and you're going to have to go to court and pay a fine. That's justice. But occasionally there's a police officer that's having a good day. Or perhaps, while we should use privilege, some are members of sororities and fraternities and other orders, and you give the police, a man or woman, a sign. All right. Can I just be truthful about it? Go ahead. And so that police officer then grants you a little bit of mercy. In other words, they say, well, what I'm going to do is, while justice says you should get a ticket and pay a hefty fine, I'm just going to give you a warning and tell you to slow down. You understand that God has extended to us not justice because we deserve to get the ticket. The ticket that says, go straight to hell. You remember the Monopoly game that said, go straight to hell, do not pass, go, do not collect $200. We deserve a ticket that says, go straight to hell. But God gives us his mercy that says, because I love you and because of my son, you got a connection, you got a network. That network is not because of you, but because of who you know and who knows you, because Jesus, because of his blood, I'm going to give you some mercy. And I'm going to give you an opportunity to get this thing right. David understood the mercy that God has given him, then he gives them grace. Grace says that it would be, and I don't know if any cops have done this, if you do, let me know, because I need to find them, but God's grace says that I'm going to give you what you don't deserve. You know how it is. Your child didn't eat all of their food, and you told them you don't eat all the food, you can't have no dessert. You already told them they don't clean up the room, and you can't go spend the night with your friends. If you don't get good grades on your report card, then you can't get a new bicycle, but then you give them grace. They can't get good grades, and you give them a fight. They can't eat all their food, but you still let them have dessert. God says, even though you've been disobedient, I'm going to still bless you. Even though you have not done and cleaned up your house like I told you to clean it up, I'm going to still bless you. Even though you've been hard-headed and you didn't want to David had a covenant directly with the Lord. Our covenant is a different covenant. David's covenant with the Lord, because David had this covenant made with him before God in 2 Samuel chapter 7. You can read it on your own in your own time, in your own private devotion. You can read chapter 7 of 2 Samuel and find the covenant that God had made with David. But it's from this covenant that God established and serves David's legacy, which brings us to our final point in our legacy. We understand as we get into the legacy that the covenant God made directly with David was with David, but he made a new covenant of blood, which we're going to celebrate here in just a little bit. And that covenant is that as often as we do this celebration, as often as we do this oracle of God, that we do show forth Christ coming again, we do show forth our appreciation for the covenant that Jesus made with his blood. So it wasn't about what we did, but it was about what Jesus did. But then we looked at the lineage, where we came from. We looked at our life, and I'm asking you, how are you living your life? What does your life speak? What would your life look like if it was left in a book? What would people read? Would folk know that you love God? Would they just know that you love stuff? Would folk know that you were devoted to God, or were you devoted to something else? Would they know that you suffered for God, or did you suffer because you were disobedient? But then legacy. What possesses a legacy is something received as from an ancestor or predecessor, resembling or suggestive of a gift by will. In other words, what are you going to leave behind? 2 Samuel 7:12 says, when your days are fulfilled and you rest with your fathers, I will set up your seed after you. Listen to what God says to David, who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name. David wanted to build a house, but God said, no, your seed he will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. If he commits iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men and with the bowls of the sons of men, the bowls of men. But my mercy shall not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I removed from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be established forever before you. Your throne shall be established forever. According to all these words and according to all this vision, so Nathan spoke to David. Hosanna, I believe that as a result of God's covenant with David, in spite of his bad parenting, God granted David's son Solomon great wisdom. Wisdom that prompted him to pen the Proverbs 26 and 22 that said, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he will not depart from it. Proverbs 13 and 22 that declared, a good man leaveth an inheritance to his children's children, and the wealth of the sinner is laid up for the just. Wow. And while we understand that what David is talking about here is leaving something tangible, something material. In other words, we ought to be able to leave our children something that they can be in a better position than we were in. But there's something more importantly that we need to leave with our children. I believe that we ought to be able to leave a spiritual heritage with our children. I believe that our children ought to know that they were prayed for. They ought to be able to know how to say the Lord's Prayer.